Welcome everyone to this discussion with Katie, who's the author of More Than You'll Ever Know, which is our book for our current book club at Latin American House. And I'm Bia, and I'm taking over my colleague Naomi, who is currently on her honeymoon. So we're giving her a bit of slack so she can enjoy that. So yeah, the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask Katie some questions. First half an hour, 40 minutes, and then second half, I'm going to open the floor for people to ask their own questions. And yeah, I was going to say make sure that everyone who's not speaking has their microphone muted, but I believe they already do, so that's okay. And yeah, I guess we can start. So Katie, when did you start writing and why?
I've actually been writing since I was a very young kid. It was the earliest I can remember writing like an actual story was in third grade. A teacher gave an assignment that was about writing and illustrating a story about what you want to be when you grow up. And my little book that she gave us, these little like hardback books to write in. And I wrote about wanting to be a singer, which I can't sing and couldn't sing then. But I sort of fell in love with storytelling at that point. I was already a big reader. And so kind of ever since then, I've been writing. I used to spend summer vacations trying to get my brother and sister to have writing parties in my room with me, which they declined. And yeah, wrote sort of all throughout school, wrote my first, I guess, novel when I was 15. Thought I was going to be a really young published writer. I remember telling my dad, like, I'm going to be the youngest published writer ever. Just genuinely thought I would have a book out as a teenager. And then, yeah, I went to school, went to college, studied English and philosophy. And then afterwards, I'd interned for People magazine in college, my senior year, and they offered me a job afterwards. And so that became my first job graduating from college. And I had never been necessarily interested in pursuing journalism because it was just such a different type of writing than what I wanted to do, which was fiction. And it was really sort of scary for me as being somebody who's, I think, more naturally introverted, to kind of learn to interview people and cold call people and figure out how to pitch stories and figure out how to write stories in a way that, honors the source and at the same time is factually accurate. I found myself like wanting to punch up the language a lot more than was necessary at a lot of points, and sort of getting really emotionally involved with anyone I was interviewing in the stories. And so there were a lot of interesting lessons that I learned just in a short amount of time after graduating from university. And when the bureau, I worked for the Austin bureau, and when they closed very suddenly, I basically started freelancing. And so I was really grateful because People magazine is such a huge name here in this country that it really gave me a sense of legitimacy, I think, for jobs that I was applying for as a 22-year-old graduate. And so it took a long time, but I sort of built up like a client base, I guess, and did a lot of writing and editing in all different formats. I freelanced for a bunch of niche industry publications like Green Builders Quarterly and the Nurses Lounge, as well as for local newspapers. And then I did editing and proofreading of, people's works in progress, people's manuscripts. And so it was this really sort of crash course in this broad variety of writing and editing. But in the process, I didn't have time to work on any of my own fiction. And so I decided to apply for my MFA. And so I did that for 3 years and got my MFA in fiction, continued freelancing all throughout. And then afterwards, one of my freelance clients offered me a full-time position as the executive editor of their whole book department. They're a boutique storytelling company. And so basically they helped clients, mostly nonfiction, write and publish their books from sort of the ground up. And so I was responsible for pairing them with writers and for overseeing the whole writing process. Writers always got credit, so it wasn't ghostwriting. And I wrote several books actually in that time as well, for nonfiction for clients. And so I spent 5 years doing that, and I loved it because it was kind of like, I was working with experts in all these different fields and got to learn about things that, I didn't study in college because I was so focused on, my liberal arts major, so I wasn't learning anything about medicine, for example, or psychology. And I got to learn about all these things. But once again, I wasn't doing any fiction writing, and I was barely even reading beyond our clients' books. And so in 2015, my dad was actually the one who encouraged me to take a step back and to try to work on a novel for a year and see what happened. And it just felt like this huge risk to step back from this career that I've been building for 8 or 9 years at this point. I was scared that if I did step back, that my job wouldn't be waiting for me. I didn't like the idea of not bringing in an income. You know, I've always brought in an income, even though my husband was really supportive. But at the same time, we were starting to talk about having kids. And so it kind of felt like, you know, what would life be like after kids? Like, was this going to be kind of my last perfect window, right? The ideal window. So I ended up kind of taking that step back, which ended up being permanent. And I wrote a book from 2015 to 2017, which got an agent very quickly. And then we went on submission in late summer, early fall of 2017. And we sent it out to about 40 different editors, and nobody bought it. So it was, you know, crushing to kind of feel like I got so close and then the door shut again. And so during that time, I started working on this book to kind of take my mind off of all the waiting and the anxiety and all of that. And my agent loved the idea. She was incredibly supportive the whole time. And so she kind of felt like, well, you know, you've got this idea, you know, we're both really excited about this idea. We got so close with this one. If you can just write this next book, let's do that. And then let's try it again, basically. And so that was this around the same time I actually got pregnant. And so I had this feeling of, you know, okay, I'm going to finish the first draft by the time the baby's born, because afterwards, who knows what life's going to be like. And of course, it didn't work out that way. You know, it was 3 years between starting to write the book and then going on submission and selling it, and then another year after that. But that was a long-winded answer to your question. So yeah, the short version, I guess, is that I've always written, and it's always felt to me like just a part of who I am. You know, the times in my life when I haven't written fiction, it's like it's just something's just missing. You know, fiction for me is a way of understanding the world, or trying to understand some aspect of the world, or trying to understand some aspect of myself in a way that's also kind of an escape from the world at the same time. And so with this book in particular, you know, writing it during 2 pregnancies, 2 births, a pandemic, like it was really kind of an escape from everything else that was so hard in my real life. So yeah, it was kind of, it saved my sanity, I think, during these last few years.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's great. And I mean, the next question I have is, do you remember the first thing you ever wrote, which you did answer already?
Yeah.
Do you still have that book?
I don't. I wonder if my parents might have kept it. Not that I'm aware of. There's one other story that I remember writing. I was maybe about 9, and it was a gray binder with loose leaf paper, and the story was called Ghost Cat. And I think I got up to like 90 pages, which, you know, as a 9-year-old is a lot. And apparently, I don't remember this, but apparently I was so proud of it that I like forced it on a lot of people, including like friends of my siblings. When this book published, they were like, yeah, but nothing compares to Ghost Cat. It's like, oh, how embarrassing. I made you read that. So yeah.
Maybe you should revisit Ghost Cat. Maybe there's a hit in there.
There might be something there. I might have to revisit it. Yeah.
So what kind of reader are you? What do you enjoy reading? Or who do you?
Excuse me, everybody who didn't hear, I've been nursing this cough for a couple of weeks now. I think that I enjoy reading books. I think like my 3 criteria for books that I love are books that they have some kind of driving narrative engine, right? So things are happening. There's an element of suspense, which may or may not have to do with the crime. It definitely does not have to. But also there's a deep interest in character, as well as language itself. So a book that has beautiful sentences, really complex, nuanced characters, and some kind of driving narrative engine, I feel like those are the books I gravitate toward, and they can kind of be all over the map in terms of, what the actual plot or genre is. I think I tend to be more of like a literary suspense kind of reader. I think is where I fall most often, but I definitely go outside that as well if a story has kind of these three things about it that I love.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because it's similar things that you write and that you wrote in this book.
Yeah, when it's interesting that you say that. I think when I was trying to kind of figure out what I wanted to write and the kind of writer I wanted to be, paying attention to, the books that I loved and like what I loved about them, and realizing that they all had these three things in common, it made me feel like, okay, that's the kind of book that I want to write. I want to write a book that has that's equally invested in these three different things, right? Like, and again, I might not always write books that revolve around a crime. Like I don't in any way want to lock myself into that. But I think having some sense of, things are happening, things are building. There are things that, you as the reader don't know. There are emotional investments that are made. Like all of these things to me as a reader are what keep me, kind of hooked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting way to tackle, what am I going to write about? Is, what do I like reading? That's a good way to deal with it. So can you tell us a bit about your writing process? What challenges did you face while you were writing it? I mean, obviously you were pregnant, so there's that.
Yeah. I mean, really, the process was pretty chaotic. I think of it as going through several different phases. And the first phase of drafting was during that first pregnancy. And it ended up being a really challenging pregnancy and painful. And so even though I sort of had all the time in the world, as I look back on it now, I was so uncomfortable and in so much pain, really, that it was really difficult for me to either sit, stand, lie down, like any position was terrible after a certain point. And so I think I stopped working on it around the 6-month mark. And then I had my daughter, and she had a cow's milk protein intolerance. And so it took us a while to get that diagnosed. So she was really colicky. She seemed like she was in pain all the time. She wouldn't sleep. And so the first few months with her were really difficult from this sort of very ordinary parenting perspective, right? Of like the sleeplessness and not knowing what's going on with this creature you've just birthed, trying to figure that out. And so, it was another 4 to 5 months after she was born before I felt like things started evening out and she started napping regularly. And so when her naps did become regular, that basically became my working time. So I was like religious about, okay, she's going to go down for a nap at 10. She'll probably wake up close to 12. Okay, I'm going to write then. She's going to go back to sleep at 3 and wake up at 5. I'm going to write then. And so I was really lucky because she did take these really great naps. Like for a while, she was napping for 3 to 4 hours a day. That was for about a year. And then afterwards, the 2 naps became 1. So, my work time was kind of cut in half. But it was still at least this reliable chunk of time. And then I got pregnant the second time. The pregnancy was the same in terms of the pain. And then on top of it, we had a toddler, and the pandemic hit. And so we had just gotten childcare for 9 hours a week for my daughter about 3 months before the pandemic hit in March 2020. And so in March, we asked her to stop coming, because we just didn't know what was going on, what things were going to look like. And so basically from March 2020 for the next 18 months, maybe more, we didn't have any childcare at all. And we were, we were really cautious. And so we were home, and so I'm really lucky that my husband is able to work from home, and he's just such an equal co-parent, that but it was kind of like, for so long, we were just kind of handing kids to each other throughout the day, like little batons, right? So the other person could do what they needed to do. And then having a second newborn in the mix was, and he didn't sleep forever. So I think like really the biggest challenges in writing the book were trying to find a work schedule, during these time, like this very extreme period of like newborn sleeplessness, lack of childcare, and a pandemic. And, I think that there were days, and sometimes probably not weeks, because I was under deadline after a certain point, but definitely, significant chunks of time where I didn't have the mental clarity, or the time to sit down and work, and those days were really hard because I felt like I feel like I'm a worse parent when I don't write because, it's like I said, feels like this necessary part of me that is missing. And so I end up feeling resentful and then I feel guilty. And it's just kind of like this nasty cycle. And so I think, I don't think there's ever a balance. Like I don't feel like we've ever at all been balanced in these last few years. But I think that I'm very fortunate in that, my husband, like he's never thought of it as a problem for me to prioritize this. And he's never resented helping me prioritize it, and so I think I'm very fortunate in that regard. But still, like yeah, that's been really tough. And I think now as the kids are older, my oldest is 4.5, my youngest is 2, it's almost getting more challenging. Like I'm working less now than I did in these last 4 years because now nobody naps. And so, they're like, we still have very little childcare for the younger ones. So it's kind of nonstop. So it's really about like continuing to.
Sorry, I feel like Katie's connection might have fallen. Yeah, she just disappeared off the call there. So just gonna wait for a minute to see if she comes back. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, maybe take a break. See if Katie is able to rejoin. I'll just answer on the call. Ines, I don't have, oh, there she is. She's back. Hi.
I don't know what happened there.
That's all right. Glad to have you back. Okay.
I don't know where that cut off, but that's
yeah.
You probably got enough.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's interesting. The next question, I feel again like you've already started to touch on that, but yeah, interested to hear your thoughts. So how would you say the story or the characters of this book are they reflective of your own experiences in any way, and how so? Like I'm just picking up on things that you talk about, like motherhood and marriage and sort of the idea of like being more of a complete person when you're able to pursue your own passions and pursue what's important to you, as opposed to just being a mother. Like I'm already starting to pick up on some parallels, but if you could talk a bit more about them from your perspective, what in the book comes from your own lived experience.
Sure. I always knew that Lore would have to be a mother for the ways that it would complicate the plot. I think that, when I was doing research into people with secret families and double lives, like Cassie found it was almost all men except for, the one writer, Anais Nin, and she wasn't a mother. And so, I think the fact that like Lore had to be a mom was very clear to me from the beginning. But, as I mentioned, I started drafting the book, the month that I found out I was pregnant with my daughter. And so definitely, I think writing and editing a book during these sort of formative few years of children's lives in the pandemic really influenced and deepened that theme in ways that I didn't expect at the beginning. So I think that the thread of motherhood became much stronger throughout the writing process as it became stronger in my own life. And I think being a mother, allowed me to sort of access those emotions in a particularly raw or intense, I'll say, state right? A state time. Which is not to say that people who aren't mothers can't write motherhood, like I don't believe that at all. But I think for me, it certainly made that thread a lot richer. And I felt like, like I mentioned, it was sort of this necessary escape for me, for these little chunks of time during the day when the rest of the day was so filled with, taking care of other people's needs. And then I felt, so I talked about People magazine and not wanting necessarily to do journalism, but it's actually ended up being like a fairly big part of my career. So I continue to write nonfiction, and I've been throughout the pandemic writing more about motherhood and parenthood during the pandemic, especially for Time magazine, because I think the pandemic really sort of revealed these massive cracks in the system when it comes to the ways that parents and especially mothers are supported. Like we saw how it was not fathers who left the workforce, by the millions. It was moms, right? It was the mothers who left by the millions to stay home and teach their kids when school went virtual. It was like, we had a chance briefly to federally mandate family leave, after a baby is born, for 4 weeks, right? Which 4 weeks is absolutely nothing, after you've had a kid. It's nothing. It's a joke. And the fact that we couldn't even get that done. So there are all these sort of systemic lack of support that I think became really clear during this time, and that I found myself getting really angry about. And so, writing about it both in like my nonfiction world and then through Lore, I think definitely became a much stronger thread than anticipated. And so I think that, those motherhood experiences definitely, fell in there. I would say the only other real commonality, to my life, or something that's directly inspired by my life, was the character of Fabian. And he, so I grew up in Laredo, and I was born during the time period when this all happened. So I don't remember any of it, but I grew up with my parents' stories of it. And my dad at the time, and still does, he owned an electrical supply store. And so, they would sell like fans and doorbells and wires and everything to like contractors who were building homes. And so, similar to in the book, when the peso devalued, the home stopped being built. And so, business just kind of dropped. And so there was a period, I think also for about 2 years on and off, my dad actually did go to Austin, and then, he'd come back home, and he, would sleep on warehouse floors and shower in gym showers, and was like selling fans out of his truck, and that image, I think, always stayed with me, of my dad just kind of doing what he had to do during this time period. And so I wanted to kind of honor those experiences, that my parents had, and that so many other people their age had during this time, and that I'd never seen represented in fiction. I'd never seen Laredo in fiction. I've never seen South. Well, no, that's not true. Now there's definitely more fiction about South Texas, but it's still such a minority, compared to really anything else I've read, that I wanted to kind of take this very specific place in time and put this story there.
So obviously the book has Mexican American characters, and the sort of duality in that identity is a sort of big theme. Was that informed by your experience? Do you consider yourself Mexican American, and how do you relate to that part of your heritage?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, growing up in Laredo, it was 99% Mexican, like we would just, we just called ourselves Mexicans. Like we didn't even call ourselves Mexican Americans. We were just Mexican. And so we were the majority. And so it felt like I never had the experience of, being othered or feeling marginalized, because we lived in a city where we were all Mexican, right? Like, how could you? And of course, like there are different issues there. Like class is a huge issue in Laredo. Like that's where you really see the disparities. Like it's a city where there's a lot of wealth on the north side and a lot of poverty on the south side, and it's a couple miles in between, but yeah, so I wanted to, and that's something that I think I'll be kind of addressing more in the novel I'm working on now. But like I think that it's really exciting to me as a reader now to see how much Latinx literature is being published, but at the same time, I can't help but notice that I think that publishing is still kind of like cashing in a little bit on the traumatic aspects of a marginalized identity. And so, I think for a long time when I started to read Latin American literature and any books that were written by, Mexican authors, Mexican American authors, like there's the story you're, I think, used to hearing about the border, right? Which is about America being the dream and people crossing and the difficulty of these crossings. And these are all really important stories to tell, right? And I hope that we keep telling them, but they're not the only stories. And I feel like there's this sense of like what I wanted to write a story where, these characters' identities are centered and they're completely intertwined with their lives, but that their identities are not the source of the conflict in the book, right? Like the conflict exists regardless of whether or not they're Mexican American, but their Mexicanness informs every aspect of their lives the way it did for me growing up. Like there are all these just little unquestioned things that are just a part of your life when you live on the border that I didn't even notice until I left, for college. And then, in a sense, that was when I kind of started to have Cassie's perspective of the outsider, right? Like more and more over the years, going back, I'm able to sort of see the city from this outside perspective. But when you're growing up in it, yeah, it's this really, it's a fascinating bubble that you don't notice is fascinating until you leave. And so I wanted to represent that.
Yeah. And just I'm curious, sort of as a bilingual person, a lot of people here would also be, the sort of you incorporate a lot of Spanish in the book. Does that feel natural to you? Are you sort of trying to replicate the patterns that you heard growing up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like how does that feel as a writer to have to think in both languages at the same time? Is that a challenge or does it come quite naturally?
No, I think that, I think Lore's voice as a whole came really clearly to me. But then definitely, it was like you said, replicating sort of I would say I was trying to sort of replicate the rhythm of speech that, that is so familiar to me being from South Texas and specifically being from Laredo. When you go to Laredo, you are so much more likely to hear Spanish than English, like it's spoken everywhere. And I consider it to be sort of like Laredo is 90% bilingual, right? So you start there and then it's kind of like on a spectrum, right? So on one side of the spectrum, it's many, many people's first language, right? The other side of the spectrum, it's many, many people's second language. And then here in the middle are all the ways that Spanish is used by people for whom it's the first language and people for whom it's a second, right? And so you have this kind of really distinctive Spanglish that happens in South Texas, and even the Spanglish, sort of shifts and changes depending on class and how much Spanish you speak, and whether you speak it at home or whether it's a slang that you talk with your friends. So it's this really nuanced thing. But I wanted to, and I felt like, to me, there was no writing this particular character without incorporating the Spanglish, like. Because she would be a Spanish speaker. She's in Laredo in the 80s. She's an international banker. She's traveling to and from Mexico. So I consider Lore to be somebody for whom Spanish is almost as natural as English. And that, so in the book, she slips back, like she speaks Spanglish regularly, but then she goes full Spanish when she's mad at the kids, right? And that's really common down here in depending obviously on specific family dynamics and all of that. But yeah, really more than anything, it was that rhythm, because to me, the rhythm of that language, the rhythm of the Spanglish, like that captures place, right? And I wanted place to be really foundational to the book. And I wanted people who were from Laredo to read it and to recognize that rhythm and to recognize Laredo. And I felt like, if and as I mentioned, like, if 90% of people in Laredo are bilingual, 10% aren't, right? And so, which is that's not to say that, it's impossible to imagine a book about Laredo that's only written in English. But I felt like if I did that, anyone from Laredo reading it would feel like something was missing, right? And that, and I think it would feel very exclusionary to them. Like, I think it would make it really clear that I was writing the book for people outside Laredo versus for people inside Laredo. And not even just Laredo, but for, Latinx communities as a whole, right? Like, because growing up, there was one book by a Mexican American writer that I read, and that was Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street. And that was in 7th grade for the first 17 years of my life, one book, right? And so for a long time when I wrote stories, it was, all characters with no last names, kind of set in these really vague big cities, because I just didn't even know it was possible, to set stories in South Texas and to include Spanish in the book, or even to give characters a last name, like Gutierrez, right? Because I just never saw it. And so it felt like I realized many years later that I was telling myself I was trying to write a story that would be universal, or that would appeal to the quote unquote average reader. And in my sort of mid-20s, I realized that I kind of subconsciously imagined that the average reader was white, and that the average reader would not be interested in a story about Mexican characters from South Texas, because that's just not what I had seen. And so to me, including Spanish in this book and then not translating the Spanish felt like a way of saying, I'm writing this for our communities. And I don't want to do it in a way that excludes people who don't speak Spanish, but I want to do it in a way that makes it clear that, I'm writing for us first, and then, inviting anyone else in as well, right? And I'm very fortunate that my agent, my editors, nobody gave me any pushback about it. Even my UK editor, not once. And I don't think that's necessarily the norm in publishing, but I'm really grateful that that was my experience for this.
Someone just asked on the chat, what was the title of the book that you mentioned you read in school? Was it The House on Mango Street?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember reading that one too.
Yeah. And I remember, and
I'll drop it in the chat.
Yes.
I went to American schools as well, and now that I think about it, I think it was the only Latinx books that we studied. But hopefully,
really sad. And to think that, I lived in Laredo, and I think that, at a certain point I was curious, and I did some research about, were the books out there and I just didn't know about them, or were the books just not out there, right? And so I was in 7th grade in, I guess, 1996. And at that point, I think there was a book by a Latin American writer, a Latino writer, that I think won the Pulitzer, the Mambo Kings of something. I don't remember the full title, but there was an article in the New York Times about it. And let me see if I can find the quote, because I think it's really illuminating about what the publishing landscape was like at the time for Latinx literature. Let's see. Okay, yes. So in 1990, Oscar Hijuelos won the Pulitzer Prize for Mambo Kings Sing Songs of Love. And there was a New York Times article that said that this raised the possibility that Latino writers in the United States could at last find a wide audience for their work. And then he continues and he says, however ill-defined, Latino literature exists, sometimes eloquent, often crude, now and then with more vitality than almost anything else being written in America. Yet it remains secret, available mostly in ghetto bookstores and arcane corners of college campuses. And that's 1996, that wasn't that long ago. And that's a writer that, is ostensibly writing in support of Latino literature, but the ways that he's describing it are kind of terrible. So, I think that the publishing landscape, the literary landscape for Latino literature as little as 30 years ago, was, or sorry, not, check my math, 20 years ago, was barren, so we've made a lot of progress, but I think there's so far left to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you had to summarize it, what is the message that More Than You'll Ever Know conveys? If you had to, what do you want people to take from it, I guess?
I'm not somebody who writes in service of a message, because I think that, I think that can really oversimplify stories and make a book more of, an ideological treatise rather than, a fully nuanced story. So I think readers should take from it what they take from it. what I will say is that, I hope that it sparks conversations about Latino literature, about motherhood, and the ways in which, mothers have been sort of asked and relied upon to sacrifice parts of themselves, about the ethics and the ethical quandaries of true crime, so this kind of disproportionate representation of white women as victims in true crime, when that doesn't bear out with the statistics. And why, looking at, like, I hope that it inspires people to be sort of more critical interrogators of the kind of true crime that they consume and why. Like, I think those are worthwhile conversations. And then as well, like, I think that like I'm seeing sort of an unnerving trend of readers disparaging books because they don't like the main character, specifically female, the whole unlikable female character thing, right? And this idea that a character has to act morally the entire time in order to earn a reader's sympathies, and therefore in order for a book and even an author to earn a reader's respect. And I think that's really like a limiting way to read. And so, I think one of my goals was, presenting these two complex women who are not perfect. They're very flawed. They make extreme decisions. They hurt people. At times they don't repent, like Lore is very unapologetic, for the most part. But I think that, part of my goal with them was to sort of represent them in their full humanity, so that even if you can't empathize with a woman who is secretly married to two men at one time and, destroys her families, like maybe you can empathize with enough moments in her life to where that decision isn't as unfathomable as you would think. So I think kind of an exercise in nuance or in empathy, I guess, would be worthwhile as well. So I think those are some things I would hope readers, would take away from it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we'll open up the floor to questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can unmute yourself, maybe introduce yourself and ask something. Kieran, raising your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to turn the video on as well. Hiya. First of all, yeah, thanks for being here, and I thought the book was brilliant. I just and yeah, it made me think a lot, especially about this whole thing of empathy and the extent to which we empathize with the characters. And I was kind of thinking, the character that I empathize the least with is Duke, and he's, I think, the character that I like the least. And so I wondered, like, what was it like writing him? What do you think of him personally?
Yeah, great question. Very few people have asked me about Duke. Yeah. I see Duke as, I don't see him as being a bad person. I see him as being a person whose own fatal flaw, I guess, is the unwillingness to look beyond what he wants to see in a person. So when he and Cassie first get together, she's closed off, like she's attracted to his safety, the safety of his family, the way that they've all welcomed her, like the way that he seems to be exactly who he is, right? And she feels like, all of her life, she has been looking for somebody who is exactly who he appears to be and who offers a certain level of safety because of it. And I think the fact that, she has this really troubled past and doesn't want to talk about it aligned really well at first with the fact that Duke didn't seem to care about her past very much. Like, all he really seemed to care about is who she is in front of him at that moment. And I think that's kind of true for a lot of people. Like, I've actually been with a person who was very similar to Duke, very good person, but, just zero interest in kind of like getting past that superficial layer of who we are in front of each other at this moment. And so I see him as just being somebody who is limited, I think, by his unwillingness to go deeper with Cassie. I think that he would struggle and struggles in the end to try to understand, where her life is different from his and the ways that she has experienced trauma that he has never had to deal with. And I think that, unfortunately, I think there are so many people like that who are, they're decent people fundamentally, but kind of unwilling or unable to do the work of kind of being uncomfortable. I think Duke doesn't want to be uncomfortable ultimately. And so that's kind of how I see him.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. That's really interesting.
That was a good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else want to pop up? Don't be shy. You don't have to turn your camera on. But
Sorry, let me just unmute myself. Are you listening to me well?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Katie. Sorry, I had to join later because I had something with work. Actually, I'm still at work, but I have a question for you about I'm sorry if you already mentioned that, but did you have to make any changes between the UK and the US version of the novel?
No, what they did was that my UK and my US editor both went through the novel independently, and then they got on a phone call, they talked out, everything they wanted to convey, and then my US editor put both of their notes together in a really long document for me with each editorial round. And so I would just do one round with each of them, combining both of their notes, because I actually didn't know how it was going to work at first either. I was kind of like, I didn't know if there would really be two separate versions that I would be working on at the same time, which would be confusing, or if, the UK would need to make different requests, in order, like, for clarity, for UK readers that US readers might not need. But no, it's exactly the same version. I think that if anything's different, it might be the spelling of certain words, which I don't even know if that's the case or not. So no, they're exactly the same.
The reason why I was asking that is because obviously a US reader is more aware of the whole Latino community and the input of certain words that you use in the book. So that is why I was asking the question. Obviously, here from the UK perspective, Laredo is really away. So
Yes.
it's good to know that the UK editor went all for it. All right.
Yeah.
Best of luck with the book. I'm sure it's going to be very successful. Bye.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point, because you talked a lot about how describing place conveying place was really important. And I think if you had done a sort of British edit of it, you might have lost a bit of that. So yeah, it's great that you were sort of trusted to leave it as it is.
Yeah, and I think, trusting readers as well. Like, I got this really nice message. Like, I've gotten plenty of reviews that talk about there being too much Spanish in the book, but I got one message on Instagram that was really nice, from a woman who actually doesn't speak Spanish, but she said that she really appreciated that none of the words were translated, and she said specifically, "Thank you for trusting readers to be able to translate these words if they want to." And I loved that, because I felt like, to the question of would anything be different, if it were edited specifically for a UK audience. Like, I think that there can be the temptation to overly explain when really, if a reader, like, readers are smart, readers will get it. Readers will do the extra work if they want to, or if they need to, if they don't understand something. Like, reading is such, to me, an active thing. You're bringing your own imagination and your own experiences to the stories that you read. Like, the story you experienced with this or any book is different to what somebody else did, and that's because we bring so much of ourselves to these stories. And so I loved the idea, that this woman mentioned of trusting readers, to be able to kind of make those leaps, I guess, for themselves. And I think that was something really great, that my UK editor must have felt as well, about the UK audience, being able to trust the UK audience to kind of make those connections and not need to be overly explained to, I guess, about certain aspects. So
I think especially nowadays, like, they can Google it, and that's always an option.
Yeah.
There was something that kind of made me laugh in the book, because I struggled with I wasn't understanding every time Mexico City was referred to as DF, and I
Uh-huh.
was struggling with that. And then you actually mentioned that in the book, because Cassie says like, yeah, that took a while for me to figure out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's great to have this mentality that you trust the reader to do the work that they want to do to engage with the book.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Cassie was also sort of like a bit of a proxy for me in, Cassie to me also kind of represented readers who might not be as familiar with certain things, so having her be able to point out what DF, meant, was kind of a way to bring those readers in who might not have known.
Does anyone else have any questions? Again, I'll leave a bit of room for someone to gather up the courage. But if not, then well, I think we can probably round it off. But thank you so much for your time. Or hang on, does someone speaking there?
Yeah, sorry. I just want to sorry, I can't start my video. Okay. I just want to say that this book, when this book arrived to my life, it was like after very long conversations with a friend talking about how a woman sometimes has a double life. So when I started to read this book, and was after this long conversation with my friends, was like, okay, what is happening now? So yes, I think that something that I empathize a lot with the book is how sometimes just for the fact that, as well, just because we are women, some decisions are more just for the society. So, and how some decisions that we have along of our life, or some things that we have done in certain point, we are not able to share it with everyone, because it's like this fair, or this kind of stuff that we say, like, okay, maybe with my best friend that she knows everything of me, and maybe I don't feel that she's gonna judge me. But sometimes with your partner, you can share it, that just that certain small things, or maybe not too small. But yes, I empathize a lot with that. And as well, I talk about how and now that I listen to you, all your story about the new role as a mother, and I think that, I mean, now I also like in a point of my life where I'm asking to myself if that role is gonna be for me or not, So now that I listen to you after read your book, so it's just say thank you, because it's like see another vision, another point of view of how to live it, how to deal with that, and as well how to make a voice that is something that all the women can do, say like was difficult or it's difficult to be mother, what is more challenging on that, like be a mother and be a successful professional, and I think that we need more like more examples of that, how you can do both at the same time. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That means a lot, both of those threads, because I think that, the expectations for women are so there's such a huge double standard, and there always has been, when it comes to, what our societies expect from women and what they expect from men. And women get the bar is set so much higher for women in terms of, like how we expect them to be good, right? What it means to be a good woman, a good wife, a good mother. Like, these bars are so much higher than it is for men to be a good man, a good husband, a good father, and it makes it so much easier to to transgress, right? And suddenly become a bad mother, a bad wife, a bad woman. And I think that, definitely part of, what I was wanting to do with the book was to like push back against that and show a woman that from the outside, everybody I think would be very quick to say, she's a bad woman, she's a bad mother, she's a bad wife. But to show her, in those aspects of her humanity, where yeah, she's making decisions that are harmful to her family, but that's not all she is, because I don't think that's all any of us are. We are all more than our worst decisions, and I think with the motherhood aspect, like I was very afraid, that children would be the end of writing, it would be the end of any kind of career that I might have had as an author. And it was really like, of all things, Twitter was where I found a big sort of community of writers who were mothers of young kids and who would talk very openly about writing during their kids' nap times, writing in the car while, waiting for their kid to get out of gymnastics practice, writing in their, notes app in their phone while breastfeeding at 2 a.m. And like seeing these stories, which I had really never heard, before I guess I had a personal interest in them, was so inspiring and encouraging to me. And so, I do want to keep kind of talking about the fact that this book was made in these very unideal short amounts of time. But I do think it's important, for any woman who wants to be a mother, or who is considering motherhood, to know that like it doesn't have to be the end of any of her ambitions. It's just that things will change, right? But it doesn't, I think I'm more ambitious now as a mother than I was even before. So yeah. Thank you.
I think we have time for another question. If anyone else has a question or comment before we wrap up, this is your chance. Kieran, are you raising your hand again?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess we've got a second. Maybe like ask about Serbia and this, and like maybe the kind of similarities between. Thinking that
I'm sorry, Kieran, you're kind of breaking up a little bit.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Yeah.
Is that any better now?
Yes, no? I think so.
Like better.
Do you want to maybe type the question in the chat?
Yeah, that might be good. Sorry about that. We do have another question on the chat, actually. Which one of the characters was most difficult to develop for you?
Cassie was.
Oh, interesting.
I know, surprising. My husband was like, she's a young writer. Like, why are you struggling so much with her? I'm like, yeah, but we're very different. I think that the biggest challenge was that, Lore came with kind of this built-in fascination. I think that she had the hook of the double marriage, the secret family, the eventual murder. Like, she already had the reader's interest, I think, just by virtue of these plot points. With Cassie, it was really important to me that she be equally interesting to the reader, even without having this really dramatic background and plot points. I didn't want her to just be like a figure of the journalist framing the story of Lore. Like, I wanted her to have her own emotional journey. And so I think the hardest points for me with Cassie were balancing, I think, some of the more traditional mystery aspects or like procedural aspects of solving a crime with her own personal journey, and then making those things ideally as compelling as Lore's sections. So it was something that like I felt like I knew Cassie really well from the beginning, but for some reason I really, really struggled with getting her to that same level of depth as Lore, while at the same time using her character and her points of view to develop the mystery aspect. And so for that, my editors were amazing. Like, I feel like that was really the bulk of our work and my agent as well, during all of, our countless rounds of revision. I feel like everybody was really kind of focused on building Cassie up to the same level as Lore. And so, it makes me feel, I remember when the book was published and I started seeing, reviews that like surprisingly focused more on Cassie than on Lore. And it took me by surprise, but I was also like, it made me feel like, okay, I'm glad that she like was as full of a character as Lore was in order for a reviewer to, you know, consider her the main protagonist. But it was interesting too. I feel like, you know, white
Do you
reviewers.
think that there's an aspect of, you know, like maybe a white reviewer seeing themselves more in Cassie?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting to me. I do feel like it's kind of not like a full 50-50, but I do notice that if a reviewer is white, they're more likely to focus on Cassie as being the main protagonist. And if a reviewer is Latinx, they focus on Lore. So yeah, that's been a really interesting piece of it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if Kieran, I don't know if you've solved your mic issues. If you want to try.
Sorry, yeah. Is that any better?
Yes, it is actually. Yeah.
Is that, yeah? I'll maybe just leave the video off. I think that's maybe messing with the connection. Yeah, the only thing I was going to say, I was wondering a bit about the characters of Fabian and Andres, and like maybe it's like some of the differences and similarities between them. Because I know for me at the beginning, I kind of started off thinking that they both represented quite different things, or like quite two kind of like contrasting kinds of masculinity. But then we find out more about Andres and how his first marriage was, and they start to seem a little similar. And then you maybe kind of think that really the only difference between them is what they represent for Lorde. I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and like, yeah, I'd like to hear you speak a bit about that, maybe, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you just made about, you know, the differences between them being most significant for what they represent for Lore. To me, you know, first, it was important. I'm sorry, my husband's messaging me about lunch. It was important that that they both be like good men, right? That they both be like fundamentally decent human beings. Like the story would have been too uncomplicated if Lore fell in love with a second man because she fell out of love with the first man for whatever reason. Like, I wanted her to genuinely love both of the men for different reasons in terms of who they are as individuals, but also for the ways that they make her feel and the aspects of her own personality that they reveal. And so in some ways, like, her love for them is like almost a little selfish as well, because, you know, I think for Lore, Andres gave her access to exploring these different parts of herself that she didn't have the opportunity to explore, you know, in her life with Fabian. You know, so she and Fabian got married young in their early 20s, you know, had the boys right away. You know, she spent those first few years with the cuates, with the twins, you know, very, very much at home and overwhelmed, and then went back to work. And I think that her career really gave her a sense of individuality and an outlet away from her family. But, you know, when the 1980s sections began, she's still young. She's 32 or 33 years old. And, you know, she's now at a point in her life when, you know, her sons are 12 and they need her in considerably different ways than they used to. And I think it's an interesting transition for parents because, you know, we think that as our kids get older, you know, they'll need us less and things will get easier. But I think that the emotional need becomes so much more complicated. Like, when your kids are little, it's literally about meeting their physical needs and keeping them alive, you know, and then the older they get, the more, like, the less they need you to physically keep them alive, and the more they need you to be some kind of emotional safe place and an emotional guide, right, through their lives. And so I think that, you know, when the story, the 1980 sections begins, Lore is kind of navigating this transition and realizing that, you know, she is now also the primary earner. So her, you know, her marriage with Fabian is kind of shifting. He is really losing his own identity without being a provider, which I think is so common in, you know, Latinx communities, where, like, you know, the machismo makes the man feel like he needs to be the provider, and if he's not that, then he's failing. And so I think that, you know, Lore has been stuck in these roles with Fabian, and it's less about Fabian himself and more about, like, the roles that she has been stuck in for so long within her family. And then Andres kind of opens this door, you know, to who else she could be, right? Like, who else she actually is inside that she's never had the opportunity, you know, to explore, you know. So there are, like, the simple things like like the motorcycle rides, the fact that she actually loves them. And, she's never ridden a motorcycle before. How would she know if she loved it or not? And what the writing represents to her in terms of adventure and freedom and kind of a comfort with her own mortality. To then, reading along with Andres as he conducts his classes during the semester. At the beginning of the story, she doesn't even know what philosophy is. And then, when the earthquake hits, they're talking about, Otto and the numinous. And, so I think that what she loves about each of them is, like, I think she loves them for who they are, but I think that she really loves what they each reveal to her about herself. And so I think, like, in some ways she could probably love infinite men, right? If it meant that they would all kind of teach her something new about herself. I think she's just a person who is so hungry to know every part of who she is and every part of who she could be. And these two men, I think, give her access to different parts of herself, from the young wife and mother, and, kind of the person who keeps a family going, to then being somebody who has a little more freedom, a little more curiosity, a little more adventure. And so I think that becomes really important for her.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah,
Sure.
That's really interesting.
Okay, so I think that's more or less what we have time for. Thank you so much, Katie, for talking to us, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who came. We have recorded this session and might put it up. We'll just maybe discuss that. But yeah, we'll thank you so much, and have a great day, Katie, evening, everyone else.
Thank you all so much for having me, for reading the book, for choosing it for the book club, and for the work that you all do as well.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.